There was a time, not terribly long ago, when most people moved through their days without ever thinking about how old they were. Not because they forgot, or because it didn't matter, but because the question itself had a different weight. Age was something vague, something measured by seasons and harvests, by the wearing down of hands and the graying of hair. A person might know they were born in the year of the Great Frost, or the summer when the river ran dry, but the exact number of years since that moment was often a detail that slipped away, unrecorded and unremembered. This wasn't carelessness. It wasn't ignorance in the way we might imagine it now. It was simply that the rhythms of life were organized around other markers. You were a child until you could work. You were young until you married. You were old when your back bent, and your children took over the fields. The number itself, the precise tally of years, was a luxury that many people never encountered and never needed. In a small village in what is now central France, sometime in the early 1600s, a man wakes before dawn. He doesn't know he is 37. He knows he has been married longer than his father was when his father died. He knows his eldest son is old enough to handle the plow, and his youngest daughter still clings to her mother's skirts. These are the measurements that matter. He pulls on his boots, the same boots he has mended 4 times, and steps into the cold air. The day begins the way it always begins, with the animals and the fields and the slow, predictable turning of the seasons. His wife, stirring the fire back to life, doesn't know she is 33. She knows she has borne 6 children, buried 2, and that her hands ache more in winter than they used to. She knows the rhythm of bread making, the feel of dough that has risen just enough, the sound of her husband's footsteps on the path. She knows the names of every neighbor within walking distance and the stories of every family going back to when her grandmother was young. But the number of years she has lived? That detail exists somewhere in the unwritten air between memory and forgetting. This was ordinary. This was how most people lived for most of human history, in most parts of the world. The idea that everyone should know their exact age, that it should be written down and remembered and celebrated each year, is a modern invention. And it came about slowly, unevenly, driven by forces that had little to do with personal curiosity, and everything to do with the growing machinery of states and taxes and laws. Before there were birth certificates, before there were parish registers, before there were calendars hanging in every home, there was only memory. And memory, when it came to dates, was a fragile and inconsistent thing. People remembered events, not numbers. They remembered the year the bridge collapsed, the winter of deep snow, the summer when the wells went dry. A child born during that summer was known as being from that time. And as the years passed, the exact count of those years became less and less important. In England in the late 1500s, parish churches began keeping records of baptisms, marriages, and burials. This was a new practice ordered by the state, and it was met with confusion and resistance in many places. The priest would ask the parents for the date of the child's birth, and often they could only offer an approximation. Sometime after Easter, they might say, or before the harvest. The priest would write something down, a guess, a best estimate, and the child's entry into the record would be marked with a date that might be off by weeks or even months. These records were not kept for the benefit of the families. They were kept for the church, for the state, for the distant eyes of authority that wanted to know how many people lived in each parish, how many were born, how many died. The families themselves rarely saw these records. A farmer in a village in Kent had no reason to visit the parish book. His children's births were recorded, but he didn't think of them in terms of dates. He thought of them in terms of the order they came, the seasons they were born, the ways their lives unfolded. As the decades passed, the practice of record-keeping spread, slowly, unevenly, across Europe, and into the colonies. In some places, it became routine. In others, it remained haphazard, dependent on the diligence of a single priest or clerk. And when that person died or moved away, the records might stop entirely. A gap of 10 years, 20 years, was not uncommon. And during those gaps, children were born, people married, lives ended, all without any written trace. In rural Spain in the early 1700s, a woman gives birth to her 5th child. The midwife attends, the neighbors gather, the child is welcomed into the world. No one writes anything down. The mother knows this is her 5th, and she knows the eldest is old enough to help with the washing, and the second can watch the younger ones while she works in the garden. She doesn't know the exact years between them. She doesn't need to. The parish priest will record the baptism a few weeks later, and he will write a date, but the mother will never see it. The date exists in a book in a church, far from her daily life, a detail that has no bearing on the way she raises her children or manages her household. This distance between official records and lived experience was the norm for centuries. Even in places where records were kept, they were kept for bureaucratic purposes, not personal ones. The people whose lives were being recorded had no access to that information, no way to check it, no reason to care about it. Their sense of time was shaped by the world around them, not by numbers on a page. In the cities, things were different, but only slightly. Merchants and tradespeople, especially those involved in contracts and apprenticeships, had more reason to track ages. An apprentice might be bound to a master for 7 years, and the contract would specify the age at which the apprenticeship began. But even here, the age was often an estimate. A boy might be described as about 12 years old, and the contract would be written with that vague language. If he was actually 11 or 13, it rarely mattered. In London, in the mid-1600s, a boy is apprenticed to a shoemaker. The contract says he is 12. His mother, when asked, said he was around that age, maybe a bit younger, maybe a bit older. She remembered he was born in a cold winter, the one when the Thames froze, but she couldn't remember the exact year. The shoemaker doesn't care. What matters is whether the boy can learn the trade, whether his hands are steady, whether he shows up on time. The number 12 is written in the contract because a number is required, but it is more a formality than a fact. Over time, this boy will grow into a man, and he will continue to live without a precise knowledge of his age. He will know he is no longer young, that his knees hurt when he climbs stairs, that his hair is thinning. He will train his own apprentices, and when they ask how old he is, he will shrug and say something vague. Old enough to know better, he might joke, and the apprentice will laugh, and the question will be forgotten. This casualness about age extended even to the powerful. Kings and queens, nobles and landowners had their births recorded with more care than common people, but even they sometimes lived with uncertainty. In the medieval period, and well into the early modern era, royal births were noted, but the records were not always precise. A prince might be described as being born on a particular saint's day, and the year might be noted, but discrepancies crept in. Different chronicles might give different dates. Later, historians would have to sift through conflicting accounts, trying to pin down the exact moment of birth, and sometimes they would fail. For ordinary people, this uncertainty was even more pronounced. In Scandinavia, in the 1500s and 1600s, many rural communities kept no written records at all. Births, marriages, and deaths were remembered orally, passed down through families and communities. A person might know they were older than their cousin, younger than their neighbor, but the exact number of years was a detail that lived only in memory, and memory was not always reliable. An old woman, sitting by the fire in a farmhouse in Sweden, tells stories to her grandchildren. She talks about the winter when she was a girl, when the snow was so deep it covered the doorways. She talks about the summer when she married, when the fields were full of wildflowers. She doesn't say how old she was during these events. She doesn't know. She knows the sequence, the order of things, the way one season led into the next. That is enough. Her grandchildren listen, and they absorb these stories, and they will carry them forward, adding their own memories as the years go by. But the precise ages, the exact years, will remain blurry, part of a larger tapestry of time that is felt more than counted. This way of experiencing time was not limited to Europe. In many parts of the world, the concept of tracking individual ages was either non-existent or practiced only by a small elite. In China, age was sometimes calculated differently, with a person considered to be 1 year old at birth, and gaining a year not on their birthday, but at the new year. This meant that two people born a few months apart might be considered the same age, or a person might be considered 2 years older than their actual time on Earth, depending on when in the year they were born. In Japan, a similar system existed, and it persisted well into the modern era. A farmer in rural Japan in the 1700s might know he was born in the year of the horse, and he might know he was older than his brother, who was born in the year of the rooster, but the exact count of years was not something he dwelled on. The work of the farm, the planting and the harvest, the care of the animals, these were the things that structured his days. In parts of Africa, age was often measured in generations and life stages rather than years. A person was a child, then a young adult, then an elder. These transitions were marked by ceremonies and social roles, not by birthdays. An elder in a village might be respected for their wisdom and experience, but no one would ask how many years they had lived. The question itself would seem strange, irrelevant. In the Americas, among indigenous peoples, similar patterns existed. Time was measured by seasons, by the migrations of animals, by the cycles of planting and harvest. A person's place in the community was determined by their abilities and their relationships, not by their age. A skilled hunter might be young in years but old in status. An elder might be respected not for the number of their years, but for the depth of their knowledge. Even in the early American colonies, where European practices of record-keeping were transplanted, the reality on the ground was often messy. A settler in Virginia in the 1600s might have their birth recorded in a parish register back in England, but out here, in the wilderness, that record was an ocean away. If they didn't know their age before they left, they would not learn it here. And if they did know it, it might slowly fade from their awareness, replaced by more immediate concerns. Survival, building a homestead, clearing land, dealing with neighbors and native peoples and the constant press of work. A woman in one of these early settlements might know she was married at what people called a young age, and that she has now been married for many years. She might know her eldest child is nearly grown, ready to start a family of their own. But if you asked her how old she was, she might pause, count in her head, and give an answer that was off by a year or two. Or she might simply say, "I don't rightly know," and change the subject. This not knowing was not a source of shame or concern. It was simply a fact of life. In a world where written records were rare and often inaccessible, where literacy was limited, where the rhythms of life were dictated by the land and the seasons, the exact number of one's years was a detail that rarely demanded attention. But slowly, over the course of the 1700s and 1800s, this began to change. States grew more powerful, more interested in controlling and understanding their populations. Taxes needed to be collected, and for that, you needed to know who was old enough to pay. Armies needed to be raised, and for that, you needed to know who was old enough to fight. Laws were passed that set age limits for various activities, marriage, work, legal responsibility, and suddenly, age became a matter of legal importance. In England, the poor law system required parishes to keep track of the poor, to know who was entitled to relief and who was not. Age was a factor in these calculations. Children were treated differently than adults. The elderly were entitled to certain forms of support, but determining who was a child, who was an adult, who was elderly, required knowing ages, and in many cases, those ages were not known. A clerk, faced with a family applying for relief, would ask their ages. The parents might give approximate answers. The children might not know at all. The clerk would write something down, his best guess, and the record would become, over time, the official truth. A child listed as 8 years old might actually be 7 or 9, but once it was written, it became fixed. Later, if that child needed to prove their age for some legal purpose, they would point to this record, and no one would question it. This process of approximation and formalization played out across Europe and the Americas. Governments wanted numbers, and so numbers were produced, even when the underlying reality was vague. Birth certificates became more common, required by law, in more and more places. But for the people living through this transition, the shift was often invisible. A farmer in France in the early 1800s might have his children's births recorded by the local mayor, a new legal requirement, but he himself might never see the record. His sense of his children's ages would still be shaped by the old ways, by memory and observation, not by documents. In the countryside, especially in more remote areas, the old patterns persisted well into the 1800s, and in some places, even into the 1900s. A village in the mountains of Italy, cut off from the larger world, might continue to operate on oral traditions and communal memory. Births and deaths were noted, but not always written down. Ages were estimated, if they were considered at all. An old man in such a village, sitting outside his house in the sun, might be asked by a visiting official how old he is. He might think for a long time, counting backwards through the years, trying to remember the major events of his life. He might say 70 or 80, but the number is a guess. He knows he is old, that he has lived longer than most, that he remembers things from a time before the younger people were born. That is what matters to him. The official writes down the number, and it goes into a census, a column of data that will be analyzed and aggregated and used to make decisions about the region. But for the old man, the number is already forgotten. He returns to his thoughts, to the warmth of the sun, to the memories that have no dates attached to them. This disconnect between official record-keeping and lived experience created a strange doubling of reality. In the eyes of the state, people had precise ages recorded in ledgers and registries. But in their own eyes, in their own experience, those ages remained fluid, approximate, often unknown. In the United States, the census provides a window into this phenomenon. The early censuses, starting in 1790, asked basic questions about the number of people in each household, divided into broad age categories. But they didn't ask for exact ages. It wasn't until later censuses that individual ages were recorded, and even then, the answers were often estimates. A census taker, going door to door in rural Pennsylvania in the mid-1800s, would ask the head of each household for the ages of everyone living there. The answers varied wildly in their precision. Some people could give exact ages. Others would round to the nearest 5 or 10 years. A man might say his wife was about 40, and the census taker would write down 40, even though she might be 38 or 42. Children's ages were sometimes easier to pin down because parents tended to remember the order of their births, but even here, mistakes were common. A mother might say her youngest was 3, when the child was actually 4 or 2. The census taker had no way to verify this. He wrote down what he was told, and the record was made. These census records, when examined today, reveal all sorts of inconsistencies. A person listed as 30 in one census might be listed as 45 in the next, taken 10 years later. Mathematically, this doesn't make sense, but it reflects the reality that ages were often guessed, and the guesses changed depending on who was doing the guessing and when. For the people being counted, these records had little immediate impact on their lives. They didn't receive a copy of the census. They didn't check it for accuracy. The census was something done to them by the government for reasons that were often unclear. The numbers recorded were abstractions, disconnected from the daily experience of aging. But over time, these records began to matter more. As governments expanded their reach, as bureaucracies grew, as laws became more complex, the ability to prove one's age became increasingly important. And for people who had grown up in a world where ages were not recorded, this created real problems. In the late 1800s, pension systems began to be established in various countries, providing support for the elderly. But to qualify for a pension, you had to prove you were old enough. For people born before widespread birth registration, this was often impossible. They had no birth certificate. The parish records, if they existed, might be incomplete or lost. Their own memory, and the memory of their families, was all they had. A man applying for a pension might have to swear an affidavit, testifying to his age. He might bring in neighbors, people who remembered his birth, or who remembered hearing about it. These testimonies would be weighed and evaluated, and a decision would be made. But there was always uncertainty, always the possibility that the age being claimed was wrong. In the United States, after the Civil War, veterans applied for pensions, and age was a factor in determining eligibility and the amount of support. Many of these veterans had been born in the 1830s and 1840s before reliable birth records. They provided what evidence they could: family Bibles with birth dates written in, old letters, the testimony of relatives. But for many, the evidence was thin, and their ages remained, to some degree, a matter of assertion rather than proof. This uncertainty extended to other areas of life as well. Child labor laws, when they began to be enacted in the late 1800s and early 1900s, set minimum ages for employment. But enforcing these laws required knowing how old a child was. A factory owner, presented with a child who wanted to work, would ask their age. The child, or their parents, would give an answer. But if that answer was a lie, designed to get around the law, how could it be checked? In practice, it often couldn't be. Children who were 10 or 11 might claim to be 14, and without birth certificates, there was no way to prove otherwise. Inspectors would look at the child, make a judgment based on their size and appearance, but this was an imperfect method. Some children looked older than they were, others looked younger. The law said one thing, but reality was messier. Over time, the demand for proof of age led to a greater emphasis on birth registration. More and more countries and states passed laws requiring that all births be registered with a government authority. Hospitals began keeping records. Midwives and doctors were required to report births. The net of documentation tightened, slowly, unevenly, but persistently. For people born into this new system, knowing their age became automatic. The date was written down at birth, and it followed them through life. But for those born before the system was fully in place, the old uncertainty remained. A person born in 1880 might have a birth certificate, a person born in 1870 might not, and a person born in 1860 or earlier almost certainly did not. unless they came from a wealthy family or lived in a city where registration was already routine. This created a generational divide. The young grew up knowing their exact age. The old often did not. And in between were those who knew approximately, who had some documentation but not complete certainty. In immigrant communities, this uncertainty was compounded. People who came to the United States or other countries in the late 1800s and early 1900s often arrived without documents. Their births had been recorded, if at all, in distant villages, in countries they would never return to. When they filled out forms at Ellis Island or other entry points, they gave their ages, but these were often approximations. An immigrant from Italy, arriving in 1905, might say he is 25, but he might actually be 23 or 27. He doesn't have his birth record with him. He knows roughly how old he is, based on family stories and his own memories, but the exact number is uncertain. The immigration official writes down 25, and that becomes his official age in America. Years later, when this immigrant applies for citizenship, or for a pension, or for any number of official purposes, that age will be referenced. But it was always an estimate, and as time goes on, the estimate might shift. He might start saying he is a year older or younger than the official record, because his own memory of his age is not tied to that document. He is living with two ages, the official one and the personal one, and they are not quite the same. This doubling of age identity was common in immigrant communities, and it persisted for generations. Children born in America would have birth certificates, but their parents often did not. The children would grow up with a clear sense of their age, while their parents remained somewhat vague. Family stories would preserve the approximations, the guesses, the uncertainties. In African American communities in the United States, the problem of unknown ages had a particular history. During slavery, most enslaved people were not given birth certificates. Their births were sometimes recorded in plantation ledgers as property, but these records were not kept for the benefit of the individuals. After emancipation, many formerly enslaved people had no documentation of their age. An elderly man, born into slavery in the 1840s, freed in 1865, living into the 1920s, might apply for a pension or some other form of support. He would be asked his age, and he would have to guess. He might remember being a child when certain events happened, and he might count backwards from there, but the calculation was always approximate. The documentation that would pin down his age simply did not exist. This lack of documentation had real consequences. It made it harder to claim pensions, to prove eligibility for various programs, to assert legal rights. But it also reflected a deeper historical violence. The fact that enslaved people were not recognized as individuals with birth dates and identities, but as property, counted and tracked for economic purposes, not personal ones. In the decades after emancipation, efforts were made to create records, to document families, to establish identities. But for those who had been born before emancipation, the gap in documentation could never be fully filled. They lived with the knowledge that a fundamental fact about themselves, their age, was uncertain and would remain so. This uncertainty was not limited to the United States. In many colonized regions around the world, traditional systems of age reckoning were disrupted by the imposition of European-style record-keeping. Indigenous peoples in Africa, Asia, and the Americas were often required to provide birth dates for colonial censuses and registries, but these dates were frequently invented, assigned by colonial officials who had no real knowledge of the individuals they were recording. A man in rural Kenya in the early 1900s might be visited by a British colonial officer conducting a census. The officer asks his age. The man doesn't know. He knows he was born before the rains came many seasons ago, But he doesn't count years in the way the officer expects. The officer looks at him, makes a guess, and writes down a number. This number becomes the man's official age in the colonial records, but it has no connection to his actual experience of time. This process was repeated across the colonized world, creating official records that were often wildly inaccurate. But these records became the basis for all sorts of legal and administrative decisions, and over time, they took on a life of their own, shaping how people were categorized and treated by the state. In some cases, people internalized these assigned ages, adopting them as their own. In other cases, they ignored them, continuing to live by their own sense of time. The result was a layering of different temporal systems, official and unofficial, precise and approximate, existing side by side. Even in the early 1900s, in industrialized countries where birth registration was becoming universal, there were still people living who had been born before the system was in place. These individuals, now elderly, carried with them the old uncertainty. They might have a birth certificate issued retroactively, based on family testimony or old church records, but there was always a question mark, a lingering doubt. An old woman in England, born in the 1850s, applies for a pension in the 1920s. She provides a birth certificate, but it was issued only recently, created from parish records that her family sought out. The date on the certificate is probably correct, but it might be off by a few months. No one can be sure. The officials accept it because they need a date, but the woman herself knows that the date is a reconstruction, an approximation made solid by bureaucratic necessity. This tension between lived experience and official record persisted even as the system became more comprehensive. People who grew up without knowing their exact age, or who knew it only vaguely, found themselves in a world that demanded precision. They adapted, providing dates when asked, but often with an internal shrug, a private knowledge that the date was not quite the solid fact it appeared to be. In rural areas, even well into the 1900s, the old ways lingered. A farmer in Appalachia, born in the 1920s, might grow up without a birth certificate, his birth recorded only in the family Bible. He knows he is younger than his brother, older than his sister, but the exact year might be fuzzy in his memory. When he goes to school, the teacher asks his age, and he says what his mother told him to say, but he doesn't think about it much. Age is still something that happens to you, not something you track closely. This casualness about age, this sense that it is not the most important fact about a person, is something that has faded in the modern world. Today, age is everywhere. We celebrate birthdays, we note milestones, we define life stages by numbers. Childhood ends at 18, adulthood stretches to 65, and then there is old age, each phase marked and measured. But this was not always so. For most of human history, age was a background detail, something that mattered only in specific contexts. A person's identity was shaped by their work, their family, their community, their skills, their relationships. The number of years they had lived was just one piece of information among many, and often not the most important. The shift towards age consciousness happened gradually, driven by the needs of states and institutions. Schools needed to know how old children were to place them in appropriate grades. Employers needed to know how old workers were to comply with labor laws. Governments needed to know how old citizens were for military conscription, for pensions, for voting rights. Each of these needs created pressure for more precise age documentation, and over time, the documentation became ubiquitous. But the transition was slow, and it was uneven. In some places, it happened quickly, driven by strong central governments and efficient bureaucracies. In other places, it happened slowly, resisted by populations that saw no need for such precision, or that lacked the administrative capacity to implement it. In the Soviet Union, after the revolution, there was a push to modernize record-keeping, to create a comprehensive system of documentation for all citizens. This included birth registration, and the government worked to retroactively document people who had been born before the system existed. But in the vast rural areas, this process was haphazard. People were asked their ages, and they gave answers, but the answers were often guesses. The officials wrote them down anyway, creating records that had the appearance of precision but were built on a foundation of approximation. In China, similar efforts were made, especially after the establishment of the People's Republic in 1949. Birth registration became compulsory, and campaigns were launched to document the population. But in the countryside, where the majority of people lived, the old ways persisted. A peasant in a remote village might be recorded in a census, but the age listed might be off by several years. The record existed, but it was not entirely accurate. This pattern repeated around the world, in different contexts, at different times. The drive towards universal documentation, towards knowing everyone's exact age, was a project of modernity, and it encountered all the messiness and resistance that such projects always do. Even today, there are parts of the world where age remains uncertain for many people. In countries with weak state capacity, where birth registration is not universal, where literacy is low, where records are poorly kept, there are still people living without official birth dates. They know roughly how old they are, but the exact number is unknown, unrecorded, perhaps unknowable. An aid worker in a rural part of sub-Saharan Africa conducting a survey asks a woman how old she is. She thinks, counts on her fingers, mentions a drought that happened when she was a child, tries to calculate from there. She gives an answer, but it is tentative, uncertain. The aid worker writes it down, because the form requires a number, but both of them know the number is an approximation. This is not so different from the situation in Europe or America 200 years ago. The lack of documentation, the reliance on memory, the approximation of age, these are not signs of backwardness or ignorance. They are simply the result of living in a world where written records are not available or not prioritized. And even in the developed world, even today, there are echoes of the old uncertainty. Adoptees sometimes struggle to know their exact age because their birth records are sealed or incomplete. People born in wartime, or in refugee camps, or in other chaotic circumstances sometimes lack documentation. They live with approximations, with guesses, with dates that were assigned rather than recorded at birth. The assumption that everyone knows their exact age, that this is a basic fact of human existence, is a modern and Western assumption. It reflects a particular set of historical circumstances, the rise of the bureaucratic state, the expansion of record-keeping, the spread of literacy and documentation. But it is not universal, and it has not always been the case. For most of human history, most people did not know their exact age. They knew they were young, or middle-aged, or old. They knew they were older than some people and younger than others. They knew the sequence of their lives, the events that marked their passage through time. But the number itself, the precise count of years, was often absent, and often unnecessary. This is hard to imagine now, in a world where age is constantly referenced, constantly displayed. We put our birth dates on forms. We celebrate birthdays. We define ourselves in part by our age. The idea of not knowing seems strange, almost unsettling. But for the people who lived without this knowledge, it was normal. It was the fabric of everyday life. Time was measured by harvests and seasons, by the growth of children, by the accumulation of experience. The number of years was a detail that faded into the background, overshadowed by the more immediate concerns of survival, of work, of family, of community. A shepherd in the hills of Scotland, in the 1700s, tends his flock. He knows the land, every rock and stream, every patch of good grass. He knows the weather, can read the sky, knows when a storm is coming. He knows his sheep, each one, their temperaments and histories. He knows his family, his neighbors, the rhythms of the village. He does not know exactly how old he is. He knows he is no longer a young man, that his father is dead, that his son is learning the trade. These are the facts that matter. In the evenings, he sits by the fire, and he thinks about the passage of time, but not in terms of numbers. He thinks about the changes he has seen, the way the world has shifted. He remembers when he was a boy, and his father taught him to use the crook, to call the dogs. He remembers the first time he went to market on his own, the pride he felt. He remembers his wedding, the birth of his children, the death of his wife. These memories are vivid, full of detail, but they are not dated. They exist in a personal chronology, a narrative of his life, but the numbers are absent. This narrative way of understanding time, this focus on events rather than dates, is something that has been largely lost in the modern world. We have gained precision, the ability to pinpoint moments in time, to create timelines and chronologies. But we have also lost something, a certain fluidity, a sense that time is made up of experiences rather than units. The shift towards numerical age, towards the precise tracking of years, was part of a larger transformation in how societies organized themselves. It was connected to the rise of capitalism, with its need for contracts and schedules. It was connected to the growth of nation-states, with their need to count and control populations. It was connected to the development of science, with its emphasis on measurement and quantification. But it was also connected to more personal changes, to shifts in how people understood themselves and their place in the world. As age became a central category of identity, as it became something to be known and tracked and celebrated, it changed how people thought about their lives. A person who knows they are 40 might think about their life differently than a person who simply knows they are middle-aged. The number creates a specificity, a sense of position on a timeline. It invites comparison with others and with oneself. Am I where I should be at 40? Have I achieved what I wanted to achieve? How much time do I have left? These questions, so familiar to us now, were less common in a world where age was vague. Without the number, the sense of a ticking clock was less acute. People aged, of course. They felt the changes in their bodies, saw their children grow, their parents decline. But the pressure to achieve certain things by certain ages, to hit milestones on a schedule, was less intense. There is something both liberating and constraining about knowing your exact age. Liberating because it gives you a clear sense of where you are in the life course, a way to plan and anticipate. Constraining because it creates expectations, norms, a sense that certain things should happen at certain times. In the old world, where ages were unknown or uncertain, there was more flexibility. A person might marry young or old, depending on circumstances. They might have children early or late. They might start a new trade or skill at any point in their life. The absence of a clear age-based timeline allowed for more variation, more adaptability. But it also created vulnerabilities. Without documentation, it was harder to claim rights, to prove eligibility, to assert one's place in the legal and social order. As the world became more bureaucratic, more governed by rules and regulations, those without proof of age found themselves at a disadvantage. A man in his 60s, applying for a pension, struggles to prove he is old enough. He has no birth certificate, no baptismal record. He brings in people who knew him as a child, who testify to his age, but the officials are skeptical. They want documents, not testimony. The man is caught between two worlds, the old world of oral tradition and communal memory, and the new world of paper and proof. In the end, he might be denied the pension, or he might receive a reduced amount, because his age cannot be definitively established. The lack of a birth certificate, a detail that never mattered before, now has real consequences. He is penalized for living in a time when such records were not kept, for being born into a world that did not yet demand this kind of precision. This is one of the quiet tragedies of modernization, the way it creates new requirements, new standards, and then penalizes those who cannot meet them, not because of any failing on their part, but because the standards did not exist when they were young. The push for universal birth registration, for everyone to have a documented age, was often justified in humanitarian terms. It would protect children, ensure they were not exploited by labor or marriage. It would protect the elderly, ensure they received the support they needed. It would create clarity, reduce fraud, make society more fair and efficient. And to some extent, this was true. Birth certificates did help protect children, did help establish rights. But the transition was also coercive, part of a larger project of state control. Governments wanted to know who their citizens were, where they were, how old they were, not just for the benefit of those citizens, but for the benefit of the state. In some places, the requirement to register births was met with resistance. People saw it as an intrusion, an unwanted interference by distant authorities. They preferred the old ways, the informal systems of knowledge and record-keeping that existed within families and communities. But over time, resistance faded. As the system became normalized, as people grew up with birth certificates and came to see them as natural and necessary. By the mid-1900s, in most of the developed world, universal birth registration was the norm, and the idea that someone might not know their age seemed strange, a relic of the past. Yet even as the system became universal, the memory of the old ways persisted, carried forward in family stories, in the testimony of the elderly, in the experiences of immigrants and refugees and others who had lived through the transition. An old man, born in the 1910s, tells his grandchildren about his childhood. He mentions that his parents didn't know exactly when he was born, that they guessed at the date when it came time to enroll him in school. The grandchildren find this hard to believe. How could you not know your birthday? But the old man shrugs. It was different then, he says. It didn't matter as much. This sense of difference, this awareness that the past was organized around different principles, is something that fades with each generation. The children born in the late 1900s and into the 2000s have no memory of a time when birth dates were uncertain. For them, knowing your age is as natural as breathing. It is a given, a foundation of identity. But this is a recent development in the grand sweep of human history. For thousands of years, for the vast majority of people who have ever lived, age was something vague, something approximate. The idea that we should all know our exact age, that it should be documented and celebrated and referenced constantly, is a modern invention, barely more than a century old in most places. And yet, it has become so ingrained, so taken for granted, that we forget it is an invention. We think of it as a natural fact, something that has always been true. We project our own assumptions backwards, imagining that people in the past must have known their ages, must have thought about time in the same way we do. But they didn't. They lived in a different relationship with time, one that was less numerical, less precise, more tied to the rhythms of nature and the cycles of life. They measured their lives in seasons and harvests, in the growth of children and the aging of bodies, in memories and stories, and the slow accumulation of experience. This is not to romanticize the past, to suggest that life was better when people didn't know their ages. In many ways, it was harder, more precarious, shaped by forces beyond individual control. The lack of documentation meant that people were vulnerable, easily exploited, their rights and identities difficult to assert. But it is worth remembering that the way we live now, with our birth certificates and our precise tracking of age, is not the only way to live. It is a choice, made collectively over the past few centuries, driven by the needs of states and institutions. And like all choices, it has costs as well as benefits. The cost is a certain loss of fluidity, a narrowing of how we think about time and identity. The benefit is clarity, protection, the ability to claim rights and plan for the future. Whether the trade-off is worth it is not a question that can be easily answered, but it is a question worth asking. In the quiet hours of the night, when sleep is slow to come, it can be useful to think about these things, to imagine a world where age was not a number, where time was not measured so precisely. It is a way of loosening the grip of the present, of recognizing that the structures we take for granted are not eternal, not inevitable. A person lying awake, thinking about their own age, might wonder what it would be like not to know it, to live without that number, without the sense of counting down or counting up, to simply exist, moving through the days, aware of change but not quantifying it. This is not something that can be easily recaptured. We live in a world of numbers, of dates, of precise measurements. Our lives are structured by age in ways that are hard to escape. But in the imagination, in the space between waking and sleeping, it is possible to glimpse something different, a slower, vaguer sense of time. The people who lived without knowing their ages were not any less human, any less self-aware. They simply organized their self-awareness differently. They knew who they were through their relationships, their work, their place in the community. Age was one factor among many, and not always the most important. A woman in a village, working in her garden, knows herself as a mother, a neighbor, a keeper of certain skills. She knows the plants, when to sow and when to reap. She knows the stories of the village, who is related to whom, who has quarreled and who has made peace. She knows the rhythms of the year, the festivals and the holy days. She does not know exactly how many years she has lived, but she knows the shape of her life, the arc of it, the ways it has unfolded. This knowledge, this embodied sense of one's place in time, is not diminished by the absence of a number. It is simply a different kind of knowledge, rooted in experience rather than documentation. As the night deepens and the mind begins to quiet, these thoughts might drift and dissolve, becoming less distinct, less formed. The past and the present blur together, and the question of age, of time, of measurement, fades into the background. What remains is a sense of continuity, of the long, unbroken chain of human life, stretching back into the distant past and forward into an unknown future. People have always grown old. They have always been born and lived and died. The ways they have understood and measured these processes have changed, but the underlying reality has not. We are all part of that chain, connected to those who came before. Even when we cannot see them clearly, even when their lives are different from ours in ways that are hard to grasp. A farmer in medieval France, a shepherd in Scotland, a woman in rural China, an immigrant arriving at Ellis Island, all of them lived without the certainty we take for granted, without the documentation that seems so essential, and yet they lived full lives, rich with meaning and connection, shaped by forces they understood in their own terms. The knowledge of age, the tracking of years, is a useful tool, but it is not the essence of life. The essence is in the living, in the daily work, the relationships, the small moments of joy and sorrow, the slow accumulation of experience. In the end, whether we know our exact age or not, We all move through time in much the same way. We are young, and then we are not. We are strong, and then we weaken. We learn and forget, build and lose, connect and separate. These patterns are universal, transcending the specifics of how we count or measure. The story of how people worked entire lives without knowing their age is not really a story about ignorance or lack of progress. It is a story about different ways of being in the world, different priorities, different systems of meaning. It is a reminder that the structures we live within are not natural or inevitable, but made by human hands, shaped by historical forces, subject to change. And in the quiet of the night, as the mind drifts towards sleep, this reminder can be a comfort. The world has not always been as it is now, and it will not always remain this way. The past is full of people who lived differently, thought differently, organized their lives around different principles, and yet they were people, just like us, navigating the same fundamental challenges of existence. Their lives, in all their strangeness and familiarity, are part of our inheritance. The vagueness of their ages, the approximation of their timekeeping, the way they measured their lives by seasons and events rather than numbers, all of this is woven into the larger tapestry of human history. We cannot go back to that world, and perhaps we would not want to. But we can remember it, can hold it in our minds as a counterpoint to the present, a reminder of other possibilities. And in doing so, we might find a little more space, a little more flexibility in how we think about our own lives and our own relationship with time. The transition from a world without precise ages to a world with them was long and complex, full of small changes and adaptations. It happened differently in different places, at different speeds, driven by different forces. But the overall direction was the same, towards greater documentation, greater precision, greater state control over the basic facts of individual lives. This transition is not yet complete. There are still parts of the world where age remains uncertain, where birth registration is not universal, where the old ways persist. And even in the developed world, there are edge cases, exceptions, people who fall through the cracks of the system. But the dominant trend is clear. The future is one in which everyone knows their age, in which every birth is documented, in which time is measured and tracked with ever greater precision. Whether this is entirely a good thing is open to question, but it seems to be where we are headed. As the mind drifts further towards sleep, the thoughts become more fragmented, less coherent. Images surface, disconnected from the linear flow of argument. A field at dawn, mist rising. An old woman by a fire, hands moving in the firelight. A child running, laughing, unaware of the years ahead. A church tower, bells ringing, marking the hours. These images have no specific time, no clear location. They could be from any century, any place. They are the stuff of human life, the basic elements that persist across all the changes in how we organize and understand our existence. The question of age, of knowing or not knowing, fades into this larger pattern. It is one detail among many, important in some contexts, irrelevant in others. What matters more is the continuity, the sense that we are all part of something larger, something that stretches beyond individual lives, beyond the span of any single generation. In the old world, before birth certificates and censuses and precise record-keeping, people understood this continuity in their own way. They told stories, passed down through generations, linking the present to the past. They marked the passage of time with festivals and rituals, with the turning of the seasons, with the rhythms of agricultural life. These markers were not numerical, but they were real, providing structure and meaning. A person might not know their age in years, but they knew where they stood in the cycle of life, what was expected of them, what roles they were to play. This knowledge was embodied, learned through participation and observation, not through reading or formal instruction. A child grew up watching their parents, their neighbors, learning by doing, absorbing the patterns of life without needing them to be explicitly explained. And as they grew older, they took on the roles they had watched others perform. They became parents themselves, workers, elders, passing on the same knowledge to the next generation. The cycle repeated, generation after generation, with variations and adaptations, but with an underlying continuity. The introduction of precise age tracking disrupted this cycle in subtle ways. It created new categories, new expectations, new ways of thinking about the life course. Childhood became a defined stage, with a clear end at a certain age. Adulthood was divided into phases, early and middle and late. Old age was marked by a number, 65 or 70, rather than by the more fluid sense of when a person could no longer work. These changes had real effects on how people lived and thought about their lives. They created pressure to conform to certain timelines, to achieve certain milestones by certain ages. They made age a more central part of identity, something to be constantly aware of, constantly referenced. But the old sense of time, the more fluid, less numerical way of understanding the life course, did not entirely disappear. It persisted in the background, in the way people actually experienced their lives, even as they adapted to the new expectations. A person might know, intellectually, that they are 45, but their lived experience of being 45 might not match the cultural script of what 45 is supposed to be. They might feel younger or older, might not have hit the expected milestones, might be living a life that doesn't fit neatly into the categories. This gap between the number and the experience is something that many people navigate, often without fully articulating it. The number is a social fact, something that exists in documents and forms and the perceptions of others. But the experience is personal, subjective, shaped by a multitude of factors that have nothing to do with the calendar. In the old world, this gap didn't exist, because the number itself was absent. People experienced aging, but they did not measure it so precisely. They knew they were changing, that time was passing, but they did not have a fixed point of reference, a number that defined them. This absence of a fixed point created a different kind of relationship with aging. Without the number, there was less sense of a deadline, less pressure to have achieved certain things by certain times. People moved through life at their own pace, shaped by circumstances and opportunities, not by the ticking of a numerical clock. This is not to say that life was easier or less constrained. People faced many pressures, economic and social and environmental, but the pressures were different, not organized around age in the same way they are now. A person might be expected to work as long as they were able, to marry when it was practical, to have children when they could support them, but these expectations were not tied to specific ages. They were flexible, responsive to individual circumstances. The shift towards age-based norms, towards the idea that certain things should happen at certain ages, was part of a larger process of standardization, of creating uniform expectations across diverse populations. It was driven by institutions, schools, employers, governments that needed to categorize and manage people in predictable ways. Schools grouped children by age, creating age-based grades. Employers set retirement ages, defining when a person was too old to work. Governments set voting ages, drinking ages, ages of consent, creating legal categories based on numbers. These categories were useful for administrative purposes, but they also had a homogenizing effect, flattening out the diversity of individual experience. A person born on a certain date was categorized with everyone else born around that time, regardless of their actual development or circumstances. This created a tension between the individual and the category. between the lived reality of aging and the administrative reality of age. And this tension persists, even now, even in a world where age is precisely known and constantly referenced. As sleep approaches, these tensions dissolve, becoming less important. The mind lets go of the need to categorize and measure, drifting into a state where time itself becomes less distinct. Past and present merge, the boundaries between self and other blur. What remains is a sense of flow, of continuity, of being part of a larger stream of existence. This state, this pre-sleep drifting, is perhaps closer to how people in the old world experience time, without the sharp divisions, the precise measurements. It is a state of being rather than knowing, of experiencing rather than counting. The people who lived without knowing their ages were not lacking something essential. They were simply organized differently, their consciousness shaped by different structures and priorities. They experienced time as a flow, not as a series of discrete units. They knew themselves through their relationships and their work, not through a number. And in the end, this might be a more truthful way of understanding human life. We are not really defined by our age, not in any deep sense. We are defined by what we do, who we love, how we engage with the world. The number is a useful marker, a way of communicating certain information, but it is not the essence of who we are. The story of how people worked entire lives without knowing their age is, at its core, a story about the limits of measurement, the ways in which the most important aspects of life resist quantification. Age can be measured, but aging, the lived experience of growing older, cannot be fully captured by a number. This is true even now, even in our precisely measured world. We know our ages, but we do not always understand what they mean. We celebrate birthdays, but the celebrations are often tinged with ambivalence, a sense that the number is both significant and arbitrary. In the old world, without the number, this ambivalence did not exist. People simply lived, moving through the stages of life without the self-consciousness that precise measurement brings. They grew old without worrying about getting old, without comparing themselves to an imagined timeline. There is something to be learned from this, even if we cannot return to that way of living. We can recognize that the number, while useful, is not everything. We can hold it lightly, not letting it define us too rigidly. We can remember that people lived full and meaningful lives for thousands of years without knowing their precise age, and that the knowledge of age, while valuable in some ways, is not essential to being human. As the night deepens and sleep finally comes, these thoughts fade into the background, joining the stream of half-remembered dreams and fragments of consciousness. The question of age, of time, of measurement, becomes less urgent, less pressing. What remains is the simple fact of existence, the breathing in and breathing out, the slow drift towards rest. And in that rest, in that letting go, there is a kind of return to the old way, the way of people who did not count their years, who simply lived them. It is a temporary return, a brief respite from the demands of the measured world. But it is a reminder that beneath all the structures and categories, beneath all the precision and documentation, there is something more fundamental. Something that connects us to all the people who have ever lived, regardless of when or where or how they understood their place in time. The workers in the fields, the shepherds in the hills, the women by the fire, the immigrants at the border, all of them lived without certain knowledge, without the numbers that seem so essential to us now. And yet they lived, and their lives had meaning, and their experiences were real and full. We can honor their memory not by trying to recreate their world, but by recognizing that our world is not the only possible world. The structures we live within are contingent, historical, made by human hands, and subject to change. The future will bring new ways of organizing time, new ways of understanding age, new systems of measurement and documentation. But underneath it all, the fundamental patterns will remain. We will be born, grow, age, and die. We will work and love and build and lose. We will tell stories and make memories and try to find meaning in the passage of time. And whether we know our exact age or not, these patterns will continue, as they have for all of human history, shaping the texture of our days and the arc of our lives. In the end, the story of age is a small part of the larger story of time, and time is a small part of the even larger story of existence. We measure what we can, we document what we think is important, but the essence of life always escapes complete capture. There is always something left over, something that resists quantification, something that can only be experienced, not recorded. The people who worked their entire lives without knowing their age understood this perhaps better than we do. They knew that life was more than numbers, more than dates and records. It was the feel of the earth under their feet, the warmth of the sun, the presence of loved ones, the satisfaction of work well done. These things could not be measured, but they were what made life worth living. And as sleep finally arrives, as consciousness fades into the dark, these truths remain, wordless and deep, older than any system of measurement, older than any calendar or record. They are the truths that all people, in all times, have known. The truths that persist beneath the changing surface of how we organize and understand our lives. The numbers come and go, the systems rise and fall, but the essential patterns remain. Birth, growth, aging, death, work, rest, connection, solitude, joy and sorrow, gain and loss, the slow turning of the seasons and the years. These are the constants, the things that do not change even as everything around them changes. To remember the people who lived without knowing their age is to remember this deeper continuity, to recognize that we are all part of the same story, the same long unfolding narrative of human existence. And in that recognition, there is a kind of peace, a sense of being connected to something larger and more enduring than any individual life. The sleep that comes is deep and restful, unmarked by the anxieties of the modern world, free from the pressure of timelines and milestones. It is a sleep like that of the farmer after a long day in the fields, the shepherd after bringing the flock home, the mother after the children are finally settled. It is the sleep of people who live in the present, who do not worry about the future or dwell on the past, who simply do what needs to be done and then rest. And in that rest, in that letting go of all the concerns and measurements and categories that structure waking life, there is a glimpse of what it might have been like to live without the burden of knowing your exact age, without the constant awareness of time passing, without the sense that you are running out of something precious and irreplaceable. It is just a glimpse, just a moment, but it is enough to suggest that there are other ways of being, other ways of relating to time and to life. Enough to plant a small seed of doubt about the inevitability of our current arrangements, about the necessity of measuring everything, of documenting every detail. And as the night wears on, as the hours pass unmarked and uncounted, this seed grows into something larger, something more expansive. It becomes a vision of a different kind of existence, one that is less hurried, less anxious, less obsessed with the passage of time. It becomes a vision of a life lived in the moment, responsive to the needs of the day, shaped by the rhythms of nature and community, rather than by the ticking of a clock. This vision is not realistic, not in the world we live in now. We cannot undo the systems that have been built, cannot return to a pre-modern way of life. But the vision serves a purpose nonetheless. It reminds us that the way we live now is not the only way, that other arrangements are possible, that the structures we take for granted are not eternal. And in that reminder, there is a kind of freedom. Not the freedom to change everything, but the freedom to imagine differently, to question, to hold our current reality a little more lightly. The freedom to recognize that we are not entirely defined by our age, our documentation, our place in the bureaucratic order. We are also defined by things that cannot be measured, by experiences and relationships and qualities of being that exist outside the grid of numbers and dates. The people who lived without knowing their age had access to this freedom in a way we do not. They were not bound by the same expectations, the same timelines, the same sense of a life divided into discrete stages. They were freer to adapt, to change, to live according to their own rhythms rather than those imposed from outside. This is not to idealize their lives, which were often hard and precarious, but it is to recognize that they had something we have lost, a certain flexibility, a certain openness to the flow of time. And while we cannot fully reclaim that, we can learn from it, can let it inform how we think about our own lives and our own relationship with time. As the night moves towards morning, as the darkness begins to soften, these thoughts begin to fade, giving way to a quieter, emptier state of mind. The questions and comparisons and reflections dissolve, leaving only a sense of presence, of being here, now, in this moment, without past or future, without age or identity, without anything but the simple fact of existence. This is the state that sleep brings, the state that the mind reaches when it lets go of all its concerns and measurements and categories. It is a state that is, in some ways, similar to the state of people who lived without precise knowledge of their age, who experienced time more fluidly, more directly, without the mediation of numbers and records. And in this state, there is a kind of completeness, a sense that nothing more is needed, that everything essential is already present. The question of age becomes irrelevant, because there is no past to count from, no future to count towards. There is only the present, the eternal now, the moment that contains all moments. This is the destination that the long night of reflection has been moving towards, the point where all the historical details and comparisons and observations give way to something simpler and more fundamental. The story of how people worked entire lives without knowing their age is, in the end, a story about the human relationship with time, about the different ways we have understood and experienced our movement through the world. And the lesson, if there is one, is that time is not as fixed or as objective as it seems. It is shaped by culture, by technology, by the systems we create. And those systems, while powerful, are not absolute. They can be questioned, challenged, reimagined. We can choose to relate to time differently, even within the constraints of our current world. We can choose to be less governed by age, less defined by the number of years we have lived. We can choose to measure ourselves by other standards, to value other qualities, to create lives that are rich and meaningful regardless of where we fall on the timeline. This is a choice that is always available, even in a world that is obsessed with measurement, even in a culture that tracks every detail. We can resist, gently, quietly, by how we live, by what we prioritize, by how we think about ourselves and our place in time. And in making that choice, we connect ourselves to all the people who came before us, who lived without the certainty we take for granted, who navigated the world with different tools, different knowledge, different priorities. We honor their memory not by trying to recreate their lives, but by recognizing that the variety of human experience is vast, that there have been many ways of being human, and that the way we live now is just one possibility among many. As sleep deepens, as the mind finally lets go completely, these connections become felt rather than thought, a sense of belonging to a long chain of human lives, stretching back into the distant past and forward into an unknown future. The individuals in this chain are different, their circumstances varied, but they are all part of the same story, the same great unfolding of human existence. And in that story, the question of age is just one thread among many, important in some times and places, irrelevant in others. What matters more is the larger pattern, the way lives connect and diverge, the way experiences accumulate and are passed on, the way each generation learns from the last and adapts to new circumstances. The people who worked their entire lives without knowing their age were not fundamentally different from us. They faced the same challenges, the same questions about meaning and purpose, the same need to make sense of their time on Earth. They simply did so without one particular piece of information, one particular way of measuring and understanding their lives. And they managed. They lived fully, loved deeply, worked hard, raised children, built communities, created culture. They did all of this without the benefit of birth certificates and precise timelines, without the ability to say exactly how old they were at any given moment. This is a testament to human resilience, to our ability to adapt and thrive under many different conditions. It is also a reminder that the tools and systems we have now, while useful, are not essential. We could live differently, if we chose to, if circumstances required it. But for now, we live as we do, with our dates and our numbers, our calendars and our clocks. We track our ages, celebrate our birthdays, measure our lives in years and decades. And this is fine. This is how our world works. But it is good to remember, sometimes, that it was not always so. That people lived differently in the past, and that they might live differently again in the future. It is good to hold our current arrangements lightly, to recognize them as contingent and historical, rather than natural and eternal. And in the quiet of the night, in the space between waking and sleeping, this remembering can bring a kind of comfort, a sense that we are part of something larger and more enduring than any individual life or any particular system of measurement. The dawn will come, and with it the demands of the measured world, the schedules and the deadlines, the birthdays and the age-based categories. But for now, in the deep night, there is only rest. Only the slow breathing, only the quiet presence of being alive, here, now, in this moment, connected to all the other moments and all the other lives that have come before and will come after. And that is enough.